So I just finished Doom Patrol. I really liked it. My favorite character was Larry. I liked pretty much everyone. Oh, and Rita was really cool too. This is a really interesting sort of X-Men parable or Guardians of the Galaxy parable that I really like. It's kind of a DC version of Guardians of the Galaxy if they were really fucked up. Oh, and Alan Tudyk's voiceover was great. This episode does a really good job with character development for our heroes, but once again, the standout thing for this episode is the voiceover from our villain, Mr. Nobody, played by the always fantastic Alan Tudyk. His comedy and his fourth wall breaking throughout the course of this episode is hilarious, and the best thing about it is it doesn't undercut the serious tones of this episode. I really, really enjoyed that. First off, who doesn't love to kick the shit out of some crazy Nazi fucking bag muffin that happened to make the supervillain that the Doom Patrol is facing this season in Mr. Nobody? This episode was hilariously entertaining. I loved learning a little bit more about my favorite character, Larry Trainer. It was really good. I really enjoyed this episode. I liked the further character development for Cliff and Larry, and learning a little bit about how the entity inside Larry works. The main plot was kind of cool, um, although it was kind of fun seeing the Doom Patrol fail again. And it was kind of cool seeing Rita use her powers for the first time. I like this episode. In this episode, Mr. Nobody teams up with the Chief to go back in time to talk to one of Jane's personalities to help and stop the apocalypse. I really enjoyed this episode much more than last week's. Uh, Everybody was at the top of their game as usual. We get to know a little bit more about Jane's past and how she eventually was told to find the Doom Patrol. In this episode, we discover what Niles' first attempt at the Doom Patrol ended up being, and we find a little bit about Rita's backstory, Larry's backstory just a little bit, and Cliff's fascination with with finding out who his daughter is and what she's like today. Also, we learn a little bit more about Cyborg and his father and what he's got going on. All in all, a good episode. Never underestimate the cold hearted vengeance of a rat. This episode was really, really well done. I like how we learned a little bit about the psychological state of each member of the Doom Patrol through a really twisted therapy session. Basically, this episode was really well done, and I enjoyed it. In this episode, we find out how Larry first really becomes aware of the entity within him and the organization called the Bureau of Normalcy, who tried to basically weaponize the entity within him. This episode was a really fun episode. It really took a detour of the theme of the episode, which is basically getting Niles away from Mr. Nobody, but it was a welcome detour. I really like this episode because we actually go into Jane's brain and meet the several personalities that shield her from the trauma that she endured as a little girl. And we actually find out the cause of that trauma. And not only is it disgusting, but it is really, really sad. Also, In this episode, we do some really great character building between Jane and Cliff because Cliff is the one that goes into her subconscious after her. So it's really well done. In this episode, we find out the origins of the Chief, and we find out that he's immortal, and we possibly find out how he figured out to become immortal. And I loved all of these flashback scenes with Niles, Cyborg and his problems dealing with his human side and his robot side was really freaking cool. And Mr. Nobody, Mr. Nobody, and Mr. Nobody. Okay, this might be my favorite episode of the season. I loved Larry patching up things with his basically the love of his life, and basically he came full circle. Also, I love Cliff finally meeting his daughter for the first time and sort of getting some semblance of peace. And Cyborg is in some real fucking trouble. Going into this episode, I thought I was going to feel one way about it, but going out of it, I feel a completely different way. I mean, Mr. Nobody's fuckery of Vic's memories about what his father may or may not have done to him when he first had his accident was pretty cool. And the way that he played him like a violin was pretty fucking awesome. And Rita, Larry, and Crazy Jane were awesome in this episode as well. This episode really does a deep dive on the character of Rita Farr. We find out why she is so guilty and so hell bent on sort of being redeemed for one sin that she did particularly commit. I really enjoyed that scene, and it was really heartbreaking seeing her tell that story to that old man that turned out to be Mr. Nobody. Are you ready for some fucking superheroes? I am. Finally, we get a peek behind Mr. Nobody's origin story, and also we get a peek at what made Mr. Nobody, and he plays a delightful mindfuck with the Doom Patrol that reveal a secret about Niles that I possibly saw coming, but I still found delicious. I am the villain of the story, in this case for him. This episode of Doom Patrol was possibly the craziest DC TV property I've ever seen, and I enjoyed every minute of it. It was really nice to see Niles pay for his sins, but it was really nice to see that the team also really had some empathy for his situation with his daughter and Danny on the street. And seeing Alan Tudyk's performance in this episode was just grand. This season was great.
So much happened here, and so much is about to.